The Knights Templar were, for roughly 2 centuries, one of the most powerful organizations in the medieval world. They commanded armies, held castles from Portugal to the Holy Land, operated a financial network that prefigured modern banking, and answered to nobody except the Pope. Kings borrowed money from them. Crusader states depended on them for survival. Their white mantles with the red cross were among the most recognizable symbols in Christendom. Then, in the space of a few years, the entire order was dismantled, its leaders burned alive, and its name turned into a synonym for heresy. This is not a story about one catastrophic moment. It is a story about a chain of decisions, each one seemingly defensible, each one quietly tightening the rope. Losing Jerusalem and refusing to change. In 1187, Saladin destroyed the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and retook Jerusalem. The Templars lost their headquarters, their symbolic purpose, and a catastrophic number of their best fighters in a single afternoon. What followed was a chance to fundamentally rethink what the order was for. They did not take it. Instead, the Templars doubled down on the original mission, continuing to operate as a military force dedicated to recovering the Holy Land, even as the political reality of the Crusades slowly collapsed around them. It seemed reasonable because the mission was the entire identity of the order. Abandoning it would have meant asking what they were actually for. But by refusing to adapt, they became an organization that existed to solve a problem that Europe was increasingly unwilling to pay to solve. When the last Crusader city of Acre fell in 1291, the Templars retreated to Cyprus, with no territory, no clear purpose, and a great deal of money and power that suddenly looked suspicious to everyone watching, moving headquarters to Cyprus instead of Europe. After Acre, the Templars chose Cyprus as their base of operations. The reasoning was straightforward. Cyprus kept them close to the eastern Mediterranean, signaling that the reconquest of the Holy Land remained the plan. Staying near the theater of war looked serious and committed. What it actually did was isolate them from the political centers of Europe at the exact moment they needed friends in those courts. While the Templars sat on Cyprus planning campaigns that never materialized, the Hospitallers seized the island of Rhodes and built a new identity as a naval power. The Templars built nothing. They planned. They waited. And while they waited, they became increasingly easy for European monarchs to characterize as a wealthy, secretive, foreign institution that served no obvious purpose. Distance from power is dangerous when your enemies are standing right next to the throne. Lending money to Philip IV of France. The Templars were sophisticated financiers. They had invented something close to the letter of credit, allowing pilgrims and merchants to deposit money in one location and withdraw it in another, taking a cut in the process. Over time, they became bankers to the crowned heads of Europe. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, borrowed enormous sums from them to finance his wars. This seemed like a sound institutional strategy. Lending to kings created powerful patrons. What it actually created was a powerful enemy who had every financial incentive to destroy them. Philip was effectively bankrupt by the early 1300s. He had already expelled the Jews from France and seized their assets. He had already attacked the Italian banking families. The Templars were next on a very predictable list, and they apparently did not see it coming. They held the debt of a desperate king with no scruples and no other options, allowing their rituals to become secret. Sometime during the 12th century, the Templars developed initiation ceremonies that were conducted in private. The exact content of these ceremonies remains genuinely unclear, even to historians today. Within the order, the secrecy probably served a practical function, creating cohesion and a sense of shared identity among men who were expected to die for the cause. From the outside, it looked like something far more sinister. When Philip IV needed a justification to arrest the Templars in 1307, the secret rituals were the perfect weapon. Accusations of spitting on the cross, of worshipping an idol called Baphomet, of conducting obscene ceremonies flooded the royal propaganda machine. The Templars had no public record of their rituals to contradict any of it. Secrecy that was meant to protect the Brotherhood instead handed their enemies a blank page on which to write whatever was most damaging. Trusting Pope Clement V. By 1305, Philip IV had successfully engineered the election of a French pope, Clement V, who moved the papal court to Avignon, effectively placing it under French political influence. The Templars needed papal protection to survive. Clement was the pope. The logic of appealing to him was obvious. What the Templars failed to account for was that Clement was not an independent actor. He owed his position to Philip, operated within Philip's sphere of influence, and had neither the power nor the will to protect an order that Philip had decided to destroy. When Philip moved against the Templars in October 1307, Clement issued mild protests and then ultimately cooperated with the suppression. The Templars had placed their survival in the hands of a man who was himself a captive of their enemy. They trusted the institution of the papacy without accounting for the man who currently occupied it. Jacques de Molay, returning to France. Jacques de Molay was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. In 1307, he was in Cyprus, which was inconvenient for Philip's plans. Philip invited him to Paris under the pretext of discussing a new crusade. De Molay came. He had been given hints that something was wrong. There were rumors circulating about investigations into the order. A reasonable man in his position might have stayed on Cyprus, or at minimum sent representatives while keeping himself at a safe distance. Instead, de Molay traveled to Paris, attended the funeral of the French queen as an honored guest, and walked directly into the trap. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip's agents arrested virtually every Templar in France simultaneously. De Molay was taken that morning. He would spend the next 7 years in prison before being burned alive in 1314. His decision to trust the invitation was the decision that handed Philip his most valuable prisoner, confessing under torture. Once arrested, many Templars confessed to the charges against them, including de Molay himself. Under torture, they admitted to spitting on the cross, to obscene initiation practices, to denying Christ. These confessions were the legal and theological foundation of the entire prosecution. The Templars who confessed were almost certainly hoping that confession would lead to mercy, to reconciliation with the Church, to survival. That was how ecclesiastical justice was supposed to work. Confession followed by penance was meant to lead to absolution. What actually happened was that the confessions were used to validate the charges, justify the suppression of the order, and transfer Templar assets to the crown and the Hospitallers. When de Molay later recanted his confession in 1314, declaring himself and the order innocent before a public assembly, Philip had him burned as a relapsed heretic the same day. The confessions did not save anyone. They simply gave the prosecution everything it needed, failing to build political alliances after Acre. In the years between the fall of Acre and the arrests of 1307, the Templars had time and resources they did not use wisely. They were still wealthy, they still had influence, they still had men. What they lacked was a coherent political strategy for surviving in a Europe that no longer needed a military order in the Holy Land. The Hospitallers were building naval power. The Teutonic Knights had pivoted to the Baltic, carving out a territorial state in Prussia that would last for centuries. The Templars held meetings, drafted plans for new crusades that went nowhere, and made no serious effort to embed themselves in European political structures in a way that would make them costly to destroy. They remained what they had always been, soldiers waiting for a war that was not coming, in an institution that had not changed since the 12th century. When Philip moved against them, there was no king in Europe with enough invested in Templar survival to intervene. They had spent 2 centuries making themselves indispensable in the Holy Land, and forgot to do the same thing at home. The Council of Vienne, and the final silence. In 1312, Pope Clement convened the Council of Vienne, ostensibly to decide the fate of the Templars. Several Templar knights appeared, ready to defend the order before the council. Clement had them arrested. The council then dissolved the order, not by formal condemnation, which would have required proof, but by papal provision, a quieter administrative mechanism that avoided the inconvenience of actually proving the charges. The Templars' assets were transferred to the Hospitallers, though Philip managed to absorb a substantial portion in France. The order that had fought at Jerusalem, held the walls at Acre, and bankrolled the Crusades for 2 centuries, was ended with paperwork. There was no final battle, no dramatic last stand, no moment where the institution fought for its own survival with anything like the ferocity it had shown in the Holy Land. They had spent everything they had on a cause that was already lost, and when the threat came from a direction they had never trained to face, from a king's ledger and a pope's signature, they had nothing left to fight with.